What happens when a fortune so powerful it shaped America itself begins to believe it is untouchable? Built to dominate an era, inherited without discipline, and exposed when the world changed, this is how the richest family in the nation quietly lost everything. The story begins at the height of American confidence, when fortunes were measured not just in dollars, but in rail lines, steel tonnage, and the reach of influence into courts, newspapers, and governments. This family did not simply participate in the rise of the nation, they helped shape it. Their name appeared on deeds, university buildings, philanthropic foundations, and private rail cars. At dinners lit by crystal chandeliers, their wealth felt permanent, as immovable as the granite mansions lining Fifth Avenue. To the public, their success seemed inevitable, ordained by intelligence, discipline, and destiny. But great fortunes often begin with a fragile truth. They depend on systems remaining unchanged. This family's empire was built in an age when monopolies were admired, labor was expendable, and regulation was minimal. Their wealth grew through consolidation, aggressive expansion, and the quiet elimination of rivals. They understood power before they understood morality, and for decades that understanding paid off. Money multiplied itself, influence defended money, and tradition convinced each generation that what had been inherited could never be lost. The first cracks appeared quietly. New laws emerged, framed as protections for the public, but experienced by dynasties as a tax. Antitrust regulations chipped away at dominance. Labor movements demanded wages, safety, dignity. Politicians, once grateful for donations, began campaigning against concentrated wealth. The family responded the way old power often does, dismissively. They believed public outrage was temporary, reform a passing mood. They relied on lawyers, lobbyists, and legacy, confident the storm would pass. Inside the family, a different erosion was underway. The founders had been ruthless builders, obsessed with control and growth. Their children inherited comfort, not hunger. The discipline that created the fortune slowly dissolved into entitlement. Rivalries replaced cooperation. Siblings fought over shares, strategy, and status. Decisions once made by a single calculating mind were now diluted through committees, trusts, and ego. Wealth spread wider across heirs, but authority became unclear and accountability vanished. Then came the market shifts. Industries that once defined American power began to age. Railroads faced automobiles, steel faced new materials. Energy markets transformed. Where adaptation was required, the family hesitated. They had invested emotionally in the past, in symbols of dominance that no longer guaranteed profit. Innovation felt unnecessary to people who believed they had already won history's game. Younger advisors warned of disruption, but tradition spoke louder than foresight. Public perception turned sharply. Newspapers that once praised the family's philanthropy began revisiting the origins of their wealth. Labor abuses, political manipulation, environmental damage, stories long buried were repackaged for a new generation hungry for accountability. The family's name, once synonymous with success, became shorthand for excess. Protests formed outside properties that had stood undisturbed for decades. Wealth no longer protected reputation, it magnified scrutiny. The economic collapse that followed did not arrive as a single catastrophe, but as a series of losses that felt manageable until they were not. A bad investment here, a lawsuit there, a division sold to cover debt, another sold to cover taxes. The fortune was still vast, but it was shrinking, and for the first time, fear entered the conversation. The family had never learned how to operate without abundance. They reacted emotionally, selling assets at the wrong time, clinging to vanity projects, refusing to admit decline. Government policy delivered another blow.
Estate taxes, once easily absorbed, now struck repeatedly as aging heirs passed control. Each transfer fragmented the remaining wealth further. Trusts designed to preserve capital instead froze it, preventing decisive action. Legal battles among heirs drained resources faster than markets ever could. The empire that once moved with purpose now staggered under its own complexity.
Social change finished what economics had begun. The public no longer admired inherited power. New money rose from technology and innovation, indifferent to lineage. The family's social influence collapsed as quickly as their financial dominance. Invitations stopped arriving. Boards replaced them with figures who better reflected modern values. Even philanthropy lost its shielding effect. Donations were questioned rather than celebrated. The family discovered that prestige, once lost, cannot be purchased back. By the time the final assets were sold, there was no dramatic announcement, no headline declaring the end. The loss happened quietly, spread across decades, disguised as restructuring, downsizing, modernization. Mansions became museums or hotels. Private collections were auctioned to strangers. The name survived in footnotes, on plaques, in history books, but no longer in balance sheets. What remained were individuals carrying a famous legacy without the fortune that once justified it. Some adapted, entering professions their ancestors would have dismissed. Others clung to memory, living modestly among reminders of vanished grandeur. The family had not been defeated by a single enemy, but by time, arrogance, and the assumption that power once achieved is permanent. Their story is not unique, but it is instructive. Wealth built in one era can become a liability in the next. Fortunes require not just creation, but constant reinvention. The family believed their money made them immune to change, when in reality it tied them to a world that no longer existed. They lost everything not because they were unlucky, but because they mistook inheritance for invincibility. The fortune was engineered for a world that rewarded dominance over adaptation. At the time of its rise, success depended on control of resources, transportation, labor, and information. Markets were young, rules were flexible, and those willing to move aggressively could shape entire industries to their advantage. In that environment, scale itself became power. The family understood this instinctively. They built systems designed to expand outward and lock competitors out, assuming that once control was achieved, it would naturally sustain itself. For decades, it did. But every economic era carries its own logic, and the logic that creates wealth rarely lasts forever. As the nation matured, so did its institutions. Laws emerged to limit monopolies, regulate labor, and prevent the concentration of power that once defined progress. These changes did not happen overnight, nor did they announce themselves as existential threats. They arrived gradually, framed as fairness and modernization. To the family, they seemed like inconveniences rather than warnings. Their empire had survived wars, depressions, and political upheaval. A few new regulations felt insignificant by comparison. The deeper problem was psychological. When success is repeated long enough, it stops feeling conditional. It begins to feel deserved, even permanent. The family mistook historical advantage for personal superiority. They believed their dominance was proof of exceptional judgment, not timing. This belief shaped every major decision. Instead of asking how the world was changing, they asked how the world could be made to continue rewarding them. Innovation became defensive rather than visionary. Investments focused on preserving old structures instead of exploring new ones.
As technology accelerated, this mindset became increasingly costly. Entire industries that once required massive capital and physical infrastructure began to shift towards speed, flexibility, and decentralized innovation. Smaller competitors moved faster because they had nothing to protect. The family, burdened by legacy assets and traditions, hesitated. Each delay was justified as caution, prudence, or respect for proven models. In reality, it was fear of abandoning the familiar. The tools that once guaranteed success had become anchors. Markets, unlike families, do not respect history. They reward relevance. When consumer behavior changed, the family assumed loyalty would compensate. When competitors introduced cheaper or better alternatives, they relied on brand recognition rather than improvement. When profits declined, they cut costs instead of reimagining strategy. These responses treated symptoms, not causes. The empire shrank not through sudden collapse, but through missed opportunities that accumulated into irreversible decline. Leadership compounded the problem. Decision-making structures had been designed for stability, not speed. Layers of approval slowed responses to threats that required immediacy. Younger voices who understood emerging trends were overruled by elders who trusted experience over data. Risk was reframed as recklessness, even as inaction became the greater danger. By the time consensus was reached, the moment had passed. Adaptation delayed is adaptation denied. The world outside the family was also changing in less tangible ways. Public tolerance for concentrated power diminished. Practices once admired as shrewd were reinterpreted as exploitative. Transparency replaced secrecy as an expectation. The family's refusal to adjust culturally, not just economically, intensified backlash. They continued operating as though respect was automatic, earned by lineage rather than conduct. This gap between self-perception and public sentiment widened with each generation. What ultimately doomed the empire was not a lack of resources, but a lack of imagination. Adaptation requires humility, the willingness to accept that past formulas may no longer work. The family's wealth insulated them from early consequences, delaying the urgency to change. By the time decline became undeniable, options were limited and expensive. Transformations that could have been gradual and strategic now demanded desperate measures. History is filled with examples of fortunes that vanished not through disaster, but through stubborn loyalty to outdated success. This family story illustrates a central truth of power. It is always temporary unless it is re-earned in every era. Systems that dominate one generation often obstruct the next. The refusal to rebuild what once worked ensured that what once seemed unbreakable eventually became irrelevant. The original fortune was created through unity of purpose. In its earliest days, decisions were centralized, authority was clear, and ambition moved in a single direction. The builders of the empire understood that scale required discipline and sacrifice. Personal desires were subordinated to long-term strategy. Every dollar had a role, every risk was calculated, and every victory reinforced the idea that cohesion was the family's greatest asset. Wealth was not treated as comfort, but as responsibility. That understanding did not survive inheritance intact. The next generation received abundance without having endured the struggle that shaped it. Comfort replaced urgency. Where the founders saw money as a tool, their heirs experienced it as a given. The habits that preserved the fortune, restraint, reinvestment, and unified command, were gradually replaced by assumptions of permanence. Discipline, once enforced by necessity, became optional. As the family expanded, so did complexity. More heirs meant more opinions, more claims, and more emotional stakes. Ownership fragmented across siblings and cousins who did not share the same values or vision. What had once been a single voice became a chorus of competing interests. Decisions slowed, strategy weakened, authority became symbolic rather than functional. Wealth, spread thin across generations, began losing its power to act decisively. Internal conflict proved more damaging than any external rival. Disagreements over direction hardened into personal rivalries. Meetings became battlegrounds for old grievances. Law structures designed to prevent collapse, trusts, boards, and voting agreements often deepened divisions by freezing power in place. Instead of resolving conflict, the system institutionalized it. Money that could have been invested in growth was diverted into litigation, settlements, and internal management. The absence of unified leadership created space for mismanagement. Some heirs treated their share as a personal entitlement rather than a collective responsibility. Risk-taking increased, but without coordination or accountability. Vanity projects flourished while core businesses were neglected. Advisors, sensing confusion at the top, pushed agendas that served themselves more than the family. Without a shared vision, wealth became vulnerable to both incompetence and exploitation. Generational distance further eroded cohesion. Each new heir felt less connection to the origin of the fortune and less obligation to preserve it. The story of how the wealth was built became a myth rather than a lesson. Without that context, the rules that once governed behavior seemed arbitrary. Why sacrifice today for a future that felt abstract and uncertain? Short-term consumption replaced long-term stewardship. The emotional cost of inheritance is often overlooked. Wealth amplifies unresolved tensions. Sibling rivalry, favoritism, and resentment over perceived unfairness intensified with money at stake. Instead of strengthening bonds, inheritance became a source of division. Family identity fractured into individual identities, each justified by personal interpretation of legacy. The empire was no longer something to protect together, but something to extract individually. Attempts to restore order came too late. Efforts to impose governance structures were seen as power grabs rather than solutions. Calls for unity rang hollow after years of conflict. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to rebuild. Even when decline became obvious, agreement on how to respond remained elusive. Every proposed sacrifice was viewed as a loss to one branch for the benefit of another. What the family failed to recognize was that wealth alone does not bind people together. Shared purpose does. Without a common vision, wealth becomes corrosive rather than stabilizing. The fortune did not collapse because it was too small to sustain the family, but because the family was too divided to sustain the fortune. The empire was dismantled not by markets or governments, but by the slow unraveling of discipline and unity that once made it possible. For generations, wealth had functioned as both armor and authority. It insulated the family from consequences and elevated their voice above others. Money opened doors, softened criticism, and reframed self-interest as leadership. Influence flowed naturally from abundance, and abundance seemed endless. In that environment, it was easy to believe that capital alone could secure legitimacy, that financial power would always command respect regardless of how it was used. That belief began to fail as society's values shifted. Public no longer accepted wealth as proof of merit. Success without transparency invited suspicion. Fortunes inherited rather than earned attracted resentment rather than admiration. The family continued behaving as though deference was automatic, unaware that the cultural contract protecting old money had dissolved. Wealth still attracted attention, but now it attracted scrutiny first. Media transformation accelerated this change. Stories once managed quietly through private relationships became public narratives shaped by journalists and later by digital platforms. Investigations exposed practices that had long been normalized within elite circles. Labor disputes, political influence, environmental damage, and tax strategies were reframed as moral questions. The family's wealth magnified these stories rather than suppressing them. Visibility replaced privacy, and reputation became fragile. Philanthropy, which once reliably shielded, lost much of its protective power. Donations were questioned for motive and impact. Institutions that had once celebrated benefactors began setting ethical conditions. The family discovered that giving money could no longer rewrite history or silence criticism. Good deeds were weighed against past actions, and generosity was judged by outcomes rather than intent. Political influence also weakened. Financial contributions no longer ensured loyalty in an era of public accountability and